Hi everybody. So today we're going to go over some of module 7's chapter work. And so let's go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so we're going to talk about stratifications and the systems in which stratifications occur and how they affect people. So all socially stratified systems have three characteristics. They rank based on social categories of people who are common, who share common characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, race, etc. People's life experiences and opportunities depend heavily on how they are socially, how their social category ranks or is ranked. And the ranks of different social categories tend to change very slowly over time. And so we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit. All right, for example, let's talk about race in a, hold on, let's actually get this going so we can move to the next slide a little easier. How about that? All right. So slavery. Slavery is a form of social stratification in which some people are owned by other people as property. We talk about this like it's this formal thing. It's not. It is a horrendous human rights violation, and it still happens in several places in the world, and it still has ramifications for how we legislate and create policy and disproportionately have economic struggles for persons of colors here in this country. So we're gonna get into a lot of that. So we'll hang tight. In some cases, enslaved people are deprived of their most basic human rights. And in sometimes they are used for labor. And sometimes those labors are unstable and not economically efficient due to the levels of supervision and punishment involved. Today, slavery is illegal in every country in the world, but it still exists in various forms. The caste system is a social class system which is based on what kind of wealth you have. It is a special type of class society in which your position is ascribed at birth rather than achieved through personal accomplishment. And caste purity is often maintained through essentially the forbidding of marrying or sexual relations outside of one's social caste. And caste systems are also very usually intertwined in some way into ethnicity, race, or religious practices. And we can kind of get into some of that too. Class, although this one is the most frequently used concepts in sociology, there's no clear agreement on how the notion should be defined. The term we use most often, because we can define it a little better, is your socioeconomic status, because we can give numbers to those and define them by very structured categories, whereas class can be defined in many different ways, and wealth can be defined in many different ways, depending on what society you are looking at and or what what your main focus is of your study. So most of the sociologists use the term, again, socioeconomic variations or statuses. The concept of life changes introduced by Weber is the best way we understand what class means. And life changes are signify a person's opportunities for achieving economic prosperity. The idea of life chances are life chances. I don't know what I was just saying. Anyway, the idea of life chances is important because it emphasizes that although class is a powerful influence on what happens in our life, it's not completely determined. Now, depending on who you're going to talk to in sociology, those opportunities and chances are going to be very limited, and we're going to have like social exceptions and exceptions to every rule. But most, like, there are going to be a lot of people that argue in sociology that your class system is fairly structured, and that you're going to be pretty defined in that role of class structure, or you're going to be pretty stuck in where you are, and it's incredibly hard to get out, and without social networking it's even harder. Classes versus other types of stratifications. What's how does class differ from caste systems or slavery? Four main ways is class systems are fluid, class positions are partially achieved, class is economically based, and class systems are large scale and impersonal. Now again, we're going to argue that in most class systems, there's also going to be differentials and intersections with race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all of those other categories that are going to largely impact how much they are actually impersonal and how much they are unbiased, and or how much they are achieved versus ascribed. And we'll get into that as we move forward in some of these in your upper division classes. However, for the purposes of really talking through class and stratification, there is a level of attainment that can happen in a class system that is different than like a caste system, where you are born into it and you don't have a ranking system that will allow you to go any higher. Are class boundaries weakened? Will caste systems give way to class systems against the backdrop of globalizations? Due to the demands of modern industrial production, most official caste systems have already given way to class-based systems in industrial capitalist society. However, elements of caste persist in some industrial society. The relatively small proportion of interracial marriages in the U.S. is one. Say you look at India, which still by most degrees has a form of class system, but at the same time, as it moves into this, we move into a very globalized world in which we're communicating a whole lot. And so the way in which we reposition those and re-understand those categories is really determined by how those who are economically at the top of a global scale have the opportunity to restructure or redefine who and what gives way to what category. A decline in inequality in class-based societies is partly attributed to the expansion of educational opportunities and other social policies. In post-World War II era, capitalist society saw a decrease in inequality in part due to economic expansion in industrialized societies. However, this trend has reversed in recent years. Inequality has actually been increasing in the United States since the 1970s. And that's not the last couple of years, that's like the last 5 decades. But as we move through this class, we're kind of realizing that our means, economic opportunities really are dictated and really do get influenced by the different identities we carry. Our opportunities, like we were talking about in the last module, when they were talking about, for instance, higher ability after being a felon and or higher ability after, like, depending on your race. When we have those conversations about broad discriminations or broad labels that we put on specific kinds of identities, those impact your economic means and your ability to change or have your ability to make change within your own economic structure or your class system. So even though you may have all the right schools, all the right references, if you still have a certain identity and you still bump up against a certain kind of bias within a particular institution or a particular organization, you're going to come up with still a wide level of discrimination and a really hard time breaking through some of those barriers. All right, so Marx is our theorist that really talks about capitalism. He is our sociologist who we map a lot of how we understand capitalism and its basic processes and its basic or inherent flaws that are part of it. And we do this through really his analysis of class. And he talks about the means of production, which is just basically your ability to essentially have ownership of the things in which, or have a stake in the things in which you produce via your job. So, for example, say you work as a line cook in a restaurant. you are not going to necessarily get a cut of everything that you cook. You're going to get a specific amount of hourly wage. So no matter how good or how bad the restaurant does, you are still going to make that same $10 wage, because your means of production, or the things that you are producing, you are not going to get a part of. You're not going to get a part of that food. You're not going to get a part of that profit that comes out of it. What you are going to get is that same paycheck, that same hourly wage as you do that. Does that make sense? The bourgeoisie are people who own the companies, the land, the stocks. Those are the people who do have the ability to have ownership of the things that their companies produce, the things that the land that they're sitting on, the stocks that they have shares in, right? Whereas the proletariat are the people who sell their labor for wages, as opposed to really having stake in a company, or being able to have stakes in the company. And according to Mark, that relationship becomes exploitative, right? Because no matter how much money the bourgeoisie makes off the proletariat, they need the proletariat to continue to work so that the bourgeoisie can make money off of their company. But that proletariat doesn't necessarily see the same benefit, right? Because they're still seeing that same hourly wage, and they have to work hard to maintain that position, because there's so many other people that can fill that, because the bourgeoisie makes up so little of the population versus the proletariat. A surplus value. In Marx's theory, the value of a worker's labor power is left over when the value of the worker's labor power left over when an employee has repaid the cost of hiring the employee. So essentially, the surplus value is that extra money they make on top. It's the profit, right? It's the profit margin that they make based off of, they have paid their entire salary. They have, like, their salary people. They have paid their laborers. They have paid the cost of production. And now they have a profit, right? And that surplus in a capitalist system helps to increase the divide between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, because what they can do with that surplus is then, though, invest it into expanding their business, buying more stock in their business, buying stock in other people's businesses, buying out other people's businesses. So what that does is it allows the bourgeoisie to continue to cycle, to expand, essentially, right, their amount of surplus, as opposed to that surplus then gets redistributed through the entire company. And that company then has more jobs or pays more or what have you. That's not the system in which capitalism functions. The capitalist functions to essentially get that surplus value, and then take that surplus value and redistribute it into making more surplus value, not necessarily making the proletariat or the people that work for them economic partners within that company, if that makes sense. All right. And because of that, there's an exploitative factor, right? And it's a lot of why when we talk about economy in sociology, we talk about the ways in which that divide will increase, right? That divide between the wealthiest people on the globe and those who are at the bottom are going to continue to increase. And that increases because those social systems that equalize that are going away, and a lot of countries don't have them in the same capacities as they once did. Maybe post-World War, think of the way college was, the way housing markets operated, the way in which one income could garner all of that to an extent, right? These things aren't accessible in the same ways anymore because of that change in that divide between how much people at the top are making versus how much everybody else is making. That gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I can give you some more information on that, or some more videos to watch, or some little trinkets if you are interested in that. But there's some really good material out there to really kind of divvy that up a little better. And then Marx talked about communism, and communism is a social system that is based on everyone owning the means of production and sharing in the wealth that it produces, right? So this is not the same as like social communism that some particular regions in the world have attempted to do. And the main course for that, and the main reason for that, is in most of those countries that have had some form of communism, there is still a massive divide in social power, a massive divide in social economics. So it's not the same thing as what Marx was proposing. And there's a big differential in doing that, because when you talk about communism and then you juxtapose it against what it is that the general population knows or thinks Marx communism is, these two things would inherently butt heads, right? So if Marx thought that the communism that has been in China, or the communism that has been in Russia, or the communism of North Korea would suffice as the communism, like if he was looking at those systems and how they're operating now, he would not call those communist structures. And the reason for that is that there's so much inherent division, and so much inherent class division and economic distribution division, that those things aren't doing the core main point that is communism, which is essentially giving everybody a shared means of production. So essentially allowing the static to be static, to kind of level the playing field. And that's not the same thing when your power differentials are so widely skewed. All right. So Weber, on the other hand, talked about class divisions deriving from both one's relationship to control of the means of production, as well as economic differences that are unrelated to property, such as skills and credentials. So talked about status, or the social honor and prestige of a particular group and accorded by another members of society. And so status would be essentially things that you get from, it's privilege, may it be positive or negative. And it's also a pattern of behavior that essentially you follow in order to be part of a group. And the problem with these statuses were that they were achievable to some, but not always achievable to others. So for example, being part of a very prestigious education system, when Weber was really having these conversations about status, there would have been very, very little, if any, women in the conversation. Very, very few people of color in the conversation, because they had different statuses in society, and those statuses didn't allow them the privilege to have such skills and credentials as those education markers. And that's important, because if you can't acquire the statuses that allow you the opportunities in order to have that economic growth, then your position in the class system cannot change, if that makes sense. All right. So he also talked about pride groups, which are groups who suffered the negative status discrimination, and they are looked down upon by most of the other members of society. And this is going to operate in similar functions as your labeling theory, except that we're not going to just talk about deviance. We're going to be talking about the overall opportunities and distribution of resources that is allotted based on how you are measured in society by your identities and your structures. So class is an objective measure, but status depends on people's subjective evaluations of social differences. So what they're saying there is that essentially we have created these categories, right? So when we've created gender categories, because they're socially constructed, categories of race, categories of ethnicity, categories of even ability to an extent, we have created the social differences and created the systems that give power to those social differences. And in doing that, it allows those power dynamics to play out in social settings, right? So it allows, say, a white woman in a park to call the cops on a black man who's walking his dog. It allows, like, those social differences and those subjective evaluations that are based on inherent biases according to identity and status have allowed that woman the ability to say, I'm going to tap into this bias. I'm going to then call a service that I can access because of my whiteness and because I know that they'll come and protect me as a white woman, because I can be seen as a victim in a way that some other people can't. And then I am going to express my concern over a man who has had no interaction with me, but is part of this category that we have labeled deviant, harmful, etc. And so in doing that, in that interaction, what we have acquired is that the pariah group in this situation would be Black men, especially young Black men, and the people who would have the power or privilege in that situation would be a white woman. Now, that's not to say that in another situation, that white woman would not be in a position where she was in the pariah group because she was a woman, and somebody else wouldn't have been in a power situation because of another status that they had. That's not to say that you can't be both depending on what social situation you are in, because we carry multiple statuses and those intersect and those interact in the world in very distinct ways. All right. And they can't be disentangled completely, right? Weber argued that social classes also differ with respect to their power. So power, again, is that ability of individuals or members of a group to achieve aims or further the interests they hold. Power is also the ability, is a persuasive element in all human relationships, but power is also the ability to maintain or create resources for oneself and or be able to claim them from others. Okay. And that's important because power is not just about the ability to achieve something or to further your own interests. It's also about the ability to then impose those interests and oppose how you will obtain that power on another individual, right? So Davis and Moore was talking about the functions of stratification. So they really were arguing that the social stratification and social inequality are functional because they ensure that the most qualified people attracted by the rewards of society bestow will fill the roles that are most important to a smoothly functioning society. Now, the problem with this functional importance thing is, again, that they don't accurately reflect the way the world works, because it's not always the most qualified person that gets the job because there are inherent biases into the structures. And it's not always the most qualified person that even would get the opportunity to do the education or that would do the opportunity that, or have maybe the social networking to even know that the job is hiring for, right? So the problem with that is that it doesn't take into consideration how inequalities change opportunities and circumstances for individuals. And also it does not factor in how social networking is then part of those opportunities that we utilize in order to access particular roles in society, including jobs and what have you. All right. So Wright really talked about contradictory class locations, and we're going to talk about kind of how this works out. He incorporated the concepts of both Mark and Weber to classify 3 dimensions of control over resources. So there's the control over investments or money capital. There's the control over the physical means of production. So the people are the actual things you need to make it. And then the control over the labor power or the people. The contradictory class locations are the positions in the class structure, particularly routine, white-collar, or lower managerial jobs that share characteristics of class with both the people above them and below them. So while they may have some control over the labor power, they likely do not have control over the investments or money. Or maybe they do have control over the investments or money, but don't necessarily have control over their own physical means of production. And these things play out in interesting ways because their decision making usually ends up depending on, and the amount of power depends on if they're interacting with somebody that is above them in the organization or somebody that is below them in status. 2 factors differentiate class locations, and he says the relationship to authority, which is kind of how you're going to interact, right? And the position of skills or expertise. So middle class employees possessing skills that are in demand in the labor market are going to earn a higher wage in a capitalist system. So, for example, when we started moving into a corporate world that really heavily relied on the internet. There was a whole group of people that had to start learning how to troubleshoot IT, not just with computers, but also with now an entirely different technological advancement. And if they did not get those skills in order to acquire that, then the skills that they had in IT become less relevant because they are not in conjunction with how the technology was currently playing out. So in doing that, that capitalist system essentially swallowed some of those IT people, and they essentially got voted out by a population that had the skills to keep moving forward, or was obtaining the skills to keep moving forward, because that was more valuable in that particular capitalist junction. All right, so let's talk about how social class is defined in the United States. We talk about income a lot. So the money received from paid wages and salaries are earned from investments. The increase in real income in the past century has not been distributed evenly across groups, not even a little. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where the difference between that wealth gap is. But it also, when we talk about class and we attribute it to income, what it does is leaves, say, those that are on disability, or those that perhaps have income that is managed in other ways, aren't going to be really part of the discussion in the ways that they necessarily should be. So maybe those who are doing a lot of care work at home, your stay-at-home mothers, or your caregivers for the elderly that are in the family, or the elder persons in the family that maybe are producing childcare for the generation under them. Those kinds of labors aren't going to be included when we're talking about the economic variations that they create. So anytime a stay-at-home mom is staying at home, they're decreasing the amount someone is paying for daycare. They're decreasing the amount someone is paying for, say, any kind of housework that might be getting done at the same time, or maybe homeschooling that's getting done. On top of that, like if you have an older generation that's maybe retired but is taking care of childcare for a younger generation, say their grandkids or their great grandkids, those things are going to impact the economic positionality of the people under them, and so it gets hinky. We'll go with that. So again, this is going to be your structure based on how your income gap is changing. So when you look at these numbers, let me get my little arrow here. This is how much the top 5% has increased comparatively just since 1967. And you're going to see, especially due to the pandemic in the last couple of years, you're going to see this completely and utterly take another big jump. And that's because the people who primarily lost their jobs or got laid off or didn't end up coming back were not those people who had middle management or middle class jobs and could figure out how to work from home, or were necessary, like your doctors and your lawyers who stayed around and were still doing stuff. It's going to be those people who maybe worked at a restaurant that didn't make it, right? That didn't make it through that particular setting. You're going to see your impoverished continue to be really impoverished. And when you look at this map, this is 80% of your population down here, and 80% of your population is just not moving. It's not even moving in relative form to inflation, because your inflation mark is going to be somewhere around here-ish. That orange line is probably doing okay. It's in between the orange and the yellow is what I would say, where that they're still keeping up with essentially where the line is for actually income to cost of living. However, so this group's doing fine. Your top 5, top 20, they're doing fine. The bottom 80, especially the bottom 60, they're struggling at this point. And that's saying something, because when 60% of your population, probably over that, probably closer again to that 80%, are struggling financially or living paycheck to paycheck with one medical procedure that could end it, one childbirth that could end it. Those things are really going to impact American families and the American economic structure in really, really big ways. And we just haven't seen how much that's going to impact here in in the next decade or two, but it is not good. All right, so we also talk about wealth. Wealth is money and material possessions held by an individual or group. Wealth inequality in America mirrors income inequality, right? So we're still going to have that relative 80% moving and chucking slowly, super slowly. Maybe some elevation, but not comparatively to where it needs to be. And then you're going to see that top 20% that just keeps escalating. And the reason for that is that when you can talk about wealth or income and you talk about the things that are passed down, those top families are continuing to pass down an enormous amount of wealth that can just continue to grow upon. And they also control still the means of production from the company's prior generations that created the prior generation's wealth. And those things are going to escalate, and they continue to make that wealth gap more and more and more. And then you're going to see people like Bezos that are going to take advantage of opportunities such as the pandemic, and they're going to again increase their wealth so much, but not necessarily increase those for those that work within their company. And we're going to, again, that's going to continue to make that divide that Marx talked about between the bourgeoisie, or the people who actually had control of those means of production, and those who were actually doing the producing. Education. So education is one of the strongest predictors of occupation, income, and wealth later in life. But there's racial differences in educational persistence and opportunity. And again, our persons of color in this country and our women in this country have had exceedingly less opportunity over the course of time to be part of these education systems and part of these economic higher up jobs and distributions, that historically it is still really, really new for any individual of color. We're still breaking massive boundaries when it comes to who can be CEOs, boundaries about who can hold specific titles of authority. Think about the fact that we've only recently had a man of color become a president. We've still never had a female president. We've only just now had a female vice president, and had a person of color as a vice president. Like, these are important milestones, but again, they point to the fact that the most important jobs, the most prestigious jobs that we hold in this country, we have limited access to depending on our identity. And those things continue to create those economic barriers, and continue to limit class expansion for a good number of people. All right, so we also talk about occupation. Occupation is an important indicator of social status, and it's not necessarily those indicators of social status don't always match income. So, for example, we know that teachers aren't paid much in the education system here in the US. Or if you don't know that, hey, guess what? Teachers aren't paid crap in the education system in the US. But the role of teacher comes with a level of education and comes with a level of social status that teachers still carry some kind of clout. The same with, say, a librarian, right? So your public library is full of amazing humans who are incredibly intelligent and know a lot about what they're talking about, but they still don't get paid very well. However, when you hold a certain kind of job title, like a teacher or like a librarian, you're still going to be awarded a social status, because that's considered a job that, even though it makes very little compared to, say, a doctor, we still understand is a necessary part of our societal structure. We still understand that teacher is somebody who we need. That's an occupation that we need in society, and so it is elevated to a degree. Now, probably not to the social status and degree that we need it to be, or we would be economically funding it in the way that we needed that to happen. But the top ranked occupations require a fair amount of either education or public service, right? And so we're talking that through. So your doctors are going to require a very extensive medical program. I mean, even for me to be a professor sitting in front of you, there was still a very extensive college education that was required for me to be able to sit in front of you to tell you that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to this stuff, right? That I went through a good portion of studying in order to learn this stuff. I didn't sit in one class or I didn't go to a seminar and learn these things, right? Well, I did, but I just went to multiple seminars over and over and over again. But that's that's a different thing. And younger Americans are more inclined to value occupations that result in fame. So again, you're going to talk about those who acquired a skill such as a sport or some kind of actor, actress, musicians. And those people are going to also be given a social standing that is even above those of some of the occupations that we desperately need, like doctors, teachers, nurses, those postal carriers, those kinds of individuals. A contemporary portrait of the U.S. class structure. Most sociologists identify class structures in terms of wealth, income, and occupation, noting how social class influences consumption, education, health, and access to political power. There are no sharply defined boundaries between classes, and no real agreement among sociologists on where those boundaries should be. And partly that's because our poverty line changes, our amount of money needed geographically is very geographically dependent in order for your to calculate what cost of living is for people. So to round that out nationally, it gets kind of tricky. And that's all just because we want really pretty, like, neat lines. And that's not really how our system operates, especially when we're talking about cost of living across the country. Woo. But broadly speaking, you have 4 classes, sometimes 5. You have the upper class, which is a social class broadly composed of the more affluent members of society, especially those who have inherited wealth, own businesses, or hold a large number of stocks, and or have made a bajillion dollars based on whatever entertainment activity that they have created. And that has allotted them a large number of economic resources. It consists of the richest Americans, those households earning at least $250,000-ish and above, approximately 5% of all American adults. So again, you're talking about the $250,000 a year mark being the top 5%. Last time I checked, the housing market almost required that to get a, $500,000 house, which essentially at this point is like a 3-bedroom, depending on where you're at. Sometimes it's like a 1-bedroom apartment if you're in a big city. Like, it's a little bit out of sync with the actual realities that are the economic structures that is the US right now. Globalization and information revolution contributed to the rising number of super rich Americans in the recent years, but again, that rising number is still incredibly disproportionate to the actual population increase. The middle class is a social class comprised of broadly those who are working in white collar or lower managerial jobs. It's considered the households of incomes between $42,000 and $126,000, depending on where you are in the United States. That number again varies. And your upper middle class are those that are educated, your corporate managers, your small business owners, your large farm owners, your doctors, etc. Actually, a lot of your doctors are going to fall in the other one, but your lower middle class are going to be trained office workers, school teachers, nurses, salespeople, police officers, firefighters, etc. And a lot of them are falling lower into those working class now because there's not a lot of teachers that are making $42,000 a year. And there's not a lot of police officers or firefighters that I would say are making $42,000 a year either. And that's just due to the difference in geographic region again, and the difference in their ability to have things like unions, their ability to have things like state funding and federal funding that work into their pay scales. And so that middle class, again, is going to change very dependingly, because a lot of your school teachers and even salespersons are not going to make 42 a year at this juncture. Your working class is a societal class broadly composed of people who are working in blue collar or manual occupations. Household incomes range between 20 and 40, and at least 2 members of the household work to make ends meet. These are your blue collar or your pink collar jobs. Basically your factory workers, your clerical assistants, those who work in the entertainment department, those who work in retail, those kind of things. The problem here with these jobs is that 20 to 40 is essentially at a poverty line at this point. It's under in most places in the United States. And so while we call it working class, the cost of living has gotten so much more in the past 2 decades that it really has limited the ability for the working class to be part of the conversation when it comes to expansion of wealth and or inheritance and or even acquiring housing, stuff like that. The lower class is a social class comprising of those who work part-time or not at all, and whose households are typically lower than 31. Now, we say that they work part-time or not at all. You could be working up to 3 jobs and still might not make 31 a year. You could be working at what we consider untrained labor, which is a false narrative because it is trained labor. It's just not labor that we necessarily ascribe social status to. And this lower class overlaps with the working class to account for 29% of American households. Most lower class individuals live in cities, although some live in rural areas and earn a little money as farmers or part-time workers. A high percentage of lower class are non-white compared to the other social statuses. And again, I think this perspective of they don't work as much is not entirely accurate at this juncture. We're seeing a lot more of lower class individuals being those who are carrying multiple jobs, those who are maybe one in like single parents in households, or they are maybe couples of color who are working towards that. You have got maybe some undocumented individuals in the mix. But you also have a wide variety of rural individuals who just don't have the means. Think Appalachia. Just the jobs aren't there, or if they are there, the education for those jobs aren't there, and or even if you're working at maybe your Walmart, or you're working at one of the local fast food restaurants and you are making 31 a year working full time, you're still doing so at $7.25 an hour, and that's not going to get you to where you need to be. All right, so ethnic minorities versus white Americans. Minorities in the United States are more likely to hold the lowest paying jobs. Income gaps between white households and Black and Hispanic households have persisted for over 4 decades. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans is even greater than the income gap. These disparities are largely due to many barriers for Black Americans having encountered acquiring wealth throughout history. Right, so if 3 generations ago, you were living in the Jim Crow South and didn't have access to a wide number of paying jobs, but your neighbor or who was maybe a lower income white person, dad did finally have the ability with the GI Bill or something to go to college, and then allowed him to get a better paying job, which allowed the next generation to have income coming in and at their disposal, which allowed all of them to go to school, which allowed blah, 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 right? These things pile up, and your opportunities and your experiences are widely determined by what you are born into, what you are, what your identities are, how those biases then get turned out into educational biases, and so on and so forth. Social mobility, and that's really just the ability for one person to move social positionalities. The intergenerational mobility is the movement up or down a social stratification hierarchy within the course of a personal career. So that's going to be like, hey, I worked for the same company for ever and ended up deciding to go into management, ended up deciding to finally then be the board of directors, or I expanded and I started to become a partner, or what have you, or what have you. Yeah, you can have it. Versus the intergenerational, which is movement up and down so based on one generation to another. So that's, you're allowing your kids, you've made it so that you're capable now for your next generation to completely pay for their college. And because of that, they all got much higher ranking jobs maybe than you, or much more economic income than you were allotted. And because of that created for their children more inheritance, more ability to be educated, more money coming in to provide them with whatever it is they need, as well as social networking within prominent social circles. Opportunities for mobility. Social reproduction is the process whereby societies have structural continuity over time. So social reproduction is an important pathway through which parents transmit or produce values, norms, and social practices among their children. So long-range intergenerational mobility is rare. They concluded that the key factor behind occupational status was educational attainment. And so really this comes down to for the long-term intergenerational, you might get to a place where you're consistently getting to careers where you guys can where the parents can provide money to send the kids through college, to get them into the right networking, to get them into the jobs that maybe you hold, or jobs that are around you, or maybe a little above. But the long-term capability of making continual big jumps is really not as much there as it once was, because those who end up there are very few kinds of jobs that are going to allow you the capacity to make a big jump past middle class. They concluded that the key factor behind occupational status was, again, educational attainment. So you need education in order to really create or give any mobility, unless you are a trust fund kid who's just making money off of stocks or what have you. And that's a kind of a different situation in and of itself. We argue that among the factors responsible for social status, the most important is the transmission of cultural capital. Cultural capital is non-economic or cultural resources these parents pass down to their children, such as language and knowledge, and or, this is very important, social capital goes along with cultural capital, right? You're gonna get them into the same fraternities or sororities, or you're going to get them into the same organizations. You're going to get them into the same social circles that are going to allow them the networking. A lot of what this comes down to is networking, because networking is primarily one of the ways in which people get into the better schools, get into the better internships, get into the better than job application processes, get the better letters of recommendation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And these all compound into more and more opportunities, but also more and more barriers for people who don't have them. So let's talk about race. Race and education play a major part in determining upward mobility. While the odds of upward mobility are not high for anyone, they are far lower for Black people than they are for white people. Differences in education are also partly due to race. Schools remain highly segregated by race in many parts of the country to disadvantage Black children, especially those who live in poor neighborhoods, because their education systems are frankly just not funded as much because of the way in which we create educational taxes, and the way we create educational funds based on the amount of taxes that come out of a particular district. And so if you live with a very wealthy district near you, your school is going to be far more funded than, say, the one that is in maybe the inner city, in an area in which the cost of living is exceedingly lower than some of the richer parts of town. Downward mobility. Downward intergenerational mobility has increased in recent years, and that's social mobility in which individuals' wealth, income, or status is lower than that in which their parents had. Short range downward mobility occurs when an individual moves from one position in a class structure to another of nearly equal status. And really, this is going to be caused by, say, a major traumatic event. This can be caused from having a severe medical issue that costs a lot of money. This can be obtained from a recession where you lose your job. This can be obtained from divorce. This can be obtained, like, there's a lot of ways in which our economic instability can come in this country. But that can create a situation where, say, your parents had economic stability in which you do not have those same economic stabilities. How does poverty affect people, right? So defining poverty. Absolute poverty is not meeting the minimal requirements necessary to sustain a healthy existence. Now, this sounds like a really good definition of poverty, right? Not meeting the minimal requirements necessary to sustain a healthy existence. And this is where I'm going to ask you to reflect on your life a little bit. Do you have access and the means to access and or buy healthy foods as a college student? Do you have your own space? Do you have the ability to access mental health care or regular health care? Do you have the ability to access, let's see here, any kind of reproductive health care? So for women, those are going to be any kind of PAC or what have you, versus, let's see, any kind of preventative care. This is going to be including ADA accommodating means of living. Do you have transportation? And I say all of this not to make anyone feel bad, because I was that student too, right? I to an extent would still say that some of the minimum requirements necessary to sustain a healthy life are out of reach for the majority of people. And that's because a healthy existence is very, very ambiguous, right? Like, they use these flowery words because then they can argue that they are, depending on the study or depending on what it is, the grant funding, or depending on whatever it is, that healthy existence can be, I paid all my bills this month. It can be, I got food on the table. Hey, I have a car now. I have a roof over my head. Doesn't matter if that roof is leaking on me or if it's filled with asbestos. I have a roof over my head, right? So like that, the relative sustain a healthy existence is highly, highly variable. And I think that that's done intentionally, right? Relative poverty is poverty defined according to the living standards of the majority in any given status, in any given society. So if you are poverty in reference to a whole bunch of people that are struggling, that poverty doesn't necessarily look the same as, hey, we have a really thriving middle class. They're able to have the 2.5, afford the 2.5 kids and the nice house and all the groceries and all the activities for the kids and good education and what have you. There's a difference between those making 40,000 and above surviving paycheck to paycheck and you being relatively poor compared to them. And hey, these people making 40,000 and above are thriving. They're doing awesome. And I'm relative poverty comparatively. So these two things are different. And that's really what relative poverty is about. It's really about defining your living standards based on how the majority is doing. The problem with that is if the majority is struggling, then you have to really be struggling to hit poverty. The United States is the richest democracy, yet it has one of the highest childhood poverty rates in the world. Yay, us. Measuring poverty. So the poverty line is an official government measurement to define those living in poverty in the United States. The calculation results in a strict budget for the family of 4 in 2020, works out the annual cash income just over $26,000 or about $2,000 a month to cover all your expenses. Now, if we were in a classroom, this is where I would have you get out your piece of paper that I've created for you. I would have you go and look online for a place to live, the average utilities, for that place, what have you, for a family of 4, plus groceries, plus gas, plus everything, right? Everything that you could possibly need, and see if you could do it in $2,000 a month. I'm going to tell you that you can't. It is increasingly harder to keep a roof over your head and food on the table with only $2,000 a month. And our poverty line consistently does not go up in the way, it does not go up comparatively to inflation in the ways that it needs to. Critics argue that this formula greatly underestimates the amount of poverty because it overemphasizes the proportion of a family budget spent on food and severely underestimates the share spent on housing. So it's just not a good metric. We'll go with that. The working poor are people who work but whose earnings are not enough to lift them above the poverty line. Education can significantly impact the likelihood that someone will be among the working poor. Most poor people earn too much to qualify for welfare, but only 5% of those low-income families with a full-time, full-year worker receive welfare benefits, even if they are still significantly struggling. So again, poverty rates in the United States are much higher among minority groups, right? We've talked about that several times, but here's a graphic to look at. Racial disparities in median household income is because the members of minority groups often work at the lowest paying jobs, and because of and face extreme racial discrimination when it comes to the amount they're paid for any of those jobs as well. The feminization of poverty is an increase in the proportion of people who are poor that are women, and this really comes acute, is really particularly acute among families headed by Hispanic women or Black women, and that can be due to limited opportunities for well, it is also, we'll say this, it's also tied to mass incarceration of Black and brown men. It's also tied to the elevated levels of single parenthood. It's also tied to the ways in which women of color were and continue to be the most discriminated groups of people in the United States. So we'll go with that. Children in poverty, especially in racial minority children and or children of single mothers, are principal victims of poverty in the United States. 10% of non-Hispanic white children were poor compared to 29% of Black children and 25% of Hispanic children and 41% of children who live in a single mother household. As a single mother, that's a hard statistic to think about, right? That's something that takes very little for a single income household to be upended. And it's something that a lot of people in this country are terrified of or living through. And that's something that we need to consider as we work on economic plans, as we work on social welfare plans, as we work on Social Security in general. Economic recovery after the 2008 recession has benefited the super rich, but not really, though filtered down to those who face poverty. The amount of 65 plus population that's in poverty is greatly increased, and that's because, again, Social Security is not really raised in consistently to inflation and cost of living. Poverty rate estimates among older adults may underestimate how widespread older adult poverty is because the poverty rates fail to consider the high cost of medical care, which disproportionately strike older adults. Because older adults have for the most part retired from paid labor, their income is based primarily on Social Security, which is a government program that provides economic assistance to persons faced with unemployment, disability, or old age. Medicare is a program that under the U.S. Social Security Administration that reimburses hospital and physicians for medical care provided for those 65 and older. Again, the way in which you the amount that you get and or the amount of coverage you get on Medicare and Social Security varies very much depending on how much you made when you were working. So there is that. Culture of poverty is the thesis by Lewis that poverty is not a result of individual inadequacies, but is instead the outcome of larger social and cultural atmosphere in which successful generations of children are socialized. The culture of poverty refers to the values, beliefs, lifestyles, habits, and traditions that are common among those who live in conditions of material deprivation. Dependency culture is a term that Murray uses to describe individuals who rely on the state welfare programs, provisions rather than entering the labor market. The dependency culture is seen as an outcome of paternalistic welfare state that undermines individual ambition. However, just for the record, dependency culture is, there's a lot of research saying that this is just not the case and that the resources are just not providing for those who are doing everything they can to provide for those in their family and what have you. There's a lot of social circumstances that are surrounding poverty. An opposite approach to explaining poverty argues that larger social processes produce conditions of poverty that are difficult for individuals to overcome. Structural forces within society, like class, gender, ethnicity, occupation, position, and educational attainment, shape the way for which our resources are distributed, which we've talked a lot about in this. And advocates of these social structural explanations argue that the perceived lack of ambition among poor people is, in fact, the consequence of their constrained situations, not the cause of it. Social exclusion is the outcome of multiple things not being given to you to prevent individuals or groups from participating fully in economic, social, or political life. Exclusion and inclusion may be seen as economic, political, or in social terms. Agency, which is the ability to think, act, or make choices independently, can be really hindered depending on what social statuses you have and how society views those social statuses. Social exclusion can imply that someone or something is being shut out in another way that is beyond the excluded party's control, or it can be a result when people deliberately exclude themselves from aspect of mainstream society. Homeless persons. Homeless are people who have no place to sleep or either stay in free shelters or sleep in public spaces not meant for habitation. Fastest growing group of homeless people consists of families with children. Insufficient income and lack of affordable housing are the leading causes of homelessness, as well as substance use and mental health problems, which go unsupported as many mental hospitals have closed, and or the funding for those kinds of programs that work towards helping these populations have also been majorly undercut and underfunded for generations now. On top of that, I will say that we also see a rise in anti-homeless architecture, which is probably one of the cruelest things I have seen in cruelest uses of technology or technological aspects in a long time. So you're talking about floating benches so that there's not places for people to stay. You're talking about like large stakes or spikes that people have to walk through. Not only does that make it harder for those who have any kind of disabilities to get and access like the buildings that are around these things, but it also is just an unnecessary way in which to try to turn a blind eye to a population that needs assistance, as opposed to one that will cause you any kind of societal harm. How does social inequality affect your life? So depending on who you are, you're going to have a lot of different answers for that. Globalization and changes in information technology have contributed to the sharp increase of inequality in the United States since the early 70s. Although the working class is especially vulnerable to these changes, the middle class is not exempt. Stanford researchers found that young people entering the workforce today are considerably less likely than young people born 2 generations before them to out-earn their parents. So we're going to struggle this generation and the generations that precede us unless things start to change. That cost of living comparative to income made is going to continue to make struggles a lot. The struggles happen more frequently. Again, I have a lot of resources on a lot of these topics. Please don't hesitate if you're still struggling with something in here to reach out to me so that we can kind of sit down and figure out where the struggle is and or give you some resources to figure out really what we're talking about. As always, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much.